The cruise ship steward delivered towels to my room and said, "Don't eat in the main dining room tonight. Trust me." Miguel pressed a blood-stained napkin into my hand, along with the towels. "They poisoned the soup," he whispered, his voice breaking with terror. "All of it. The salad bar, the bread, everything. 200 people will be dead by midnight." My blood turned to ice water. Through my balcony door, I could see passengers lounging by the pool, laughing and drinking cocktails, completely unaware that someone was planning mass murder on the Paradise Dream. Children splashed in the shallow end while their parents checked dinner menus, deciding which restaurant to try tonight. "Who poisoned it?" "Miguel, we need to call security. Warn the captain." But he grabbed my wrist with fingers that shook like leaves in a hurricane, his grip desperate and painful. "No, they are security. The captain knows. This whole ship," his voice cracked as he fought back tears. "They're testing something. Some kind of weapon. My sister works in the kitchen. She saw them putting chemicals in the food storage. White powder, no smell, no taste." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Miguel was telling the truth, then everyone who ate dinner tonight would die, and the people responsible were the same ones passengers would run to for help. We were trapped on a floating death trap, with nowhere to run and no one to trust. "Where is your sister now?" I asked, my instincts from 20 years as an ER doctor kicking in despite the terror clawing at my chest. Miguel's face crumpled. "Dead. They found her in the freezer an hour ago. Accident, they said. Slipped on wet floor, hit her head." His hand moved to his wounded arm. I tried to stop them from moving her body. That's when they cut me. I pulled him inside and locked the door, my mind racing through 2 decades of emergency medicine experience. If this was real, if someone was actually planning to poison hundreds of people, then every second counted. But I needed proof before I could act on the word of a terrified young man with blood on his uniform. "Miguel, I need you to show me exactly what your sister saw. Where did they put the chemicals? Who gave the orders?" I grabbed my phone to record his statement, but he knocked it out of my hands with surprising force. "No recordings. They monitor everything on this ship. Phones, internet, security cameras. That's how they knew Consuela was watching them." His eyes darted toward my balcony, where other passengers were visible on their own terraces. "They can see us right now." The blood-stained napkin in my hands contained more than just Miguel's injury. Wrapped inside were 3 small plastic vials filled with white crystalline powder. Each vial was labeled with numbers and letters that looked like chemical formulas, but the writing was in a language I didn't recognize. "This is what they put in the food?" The powder looked harmless, like salt or sugar. No wonder his sister hadn't been suspicious initially. "Miguel, where did you get these samples?" "Consuela gave them to me before she died. She knew they would kill her if they found out she was collecting evidence." He unwrapped more items from the napkin, photographs taken with a phone camera, showing men in chef uniforms mixing the white powder into large containers of soup stock. The photographs were grainy and taken from a distance, but I could make out faces. One of them was Chief Security Officer David Kane, a man who'd given the safety briefing on embarkation day. Another was someone in a white coat who looked like medical personnel. A third figure was partially obscured, but his uniform suggested he was part of the ship's command structure. "Miguel, we need to get these to the FBI, the Coast Guard, someone with authority to stop this." But even as I said it, I realized the impossibility of the situation. We were in international waters, hours from the nearest port, with no way to communicate off the ship without using systems controlled by the people planning the murders. "There's more," Miguel said, his voice barely audible. "This isn't the first time. My sister found records hidden in the kitchen office, passenger manifests from other cruises, medical reports, death certificates. They've been doing this for months." He pulled out a folder of documents that Consuela had apparently stolen before her murder. Passenger lists from 3 previous Caribbean Dreamlines cruises, each showing dozens of deaths attributed to food poisoning outbreaks. But the medical examiner reports told a different story. The victims had died from exposure to an unknown toxin that caused rapid organ failure. The scope of what we were uncovering made my hands shake as I read through the evidence. This wasn't a random act of terrorism. It was systematic experimentation, using cruise ship passengers as unwilling test subjects. Hundreds of people had already died while the perpetrators refined their biological weapon. "Why cruises?" I asked, though part of me already understood the answer. Cruise ships were perfect laboratories, isolated environments with controlled populations, medical facilities to monitor the effects, and built-in cover stories about food poisoning outbreaks that wouldn't trigger extensive investigations. Miguel's wounded arm was bleeding through the makeshift bandage I'd applied. They pick cruises with certain types of passengers: elderly people, families with children, people who won't be missed quickly if they don't come home. His voice was getting weaker, probably from blood loss and shock. The dinner bell chimed throughout the ship, a melodic sound that now felt like a death knell. Through my balcony door, I could see passengers heading toward the dining areas, dressed in their finest clothes for another evening of luxury dining. None of them knew they were walking toward their execution. "Miguel, I'm going to help you. But first I need to warn people. There has to be a way to reach the outside world. Emergency radios, satellite phones, something that bypasses the ship's communication systems." I was already moving toward my closet, looking for anything that might be useful. The lifeboats have emergency transmitters, Miguel said, but his voice carried no hope. But they are guarded by security, and even if you reach someone, who will believe you? A divorced doctor on vacation and a housekeeper who can barely speak English? Claiming the ship's officers are mass murderers? He was right, but I couldn't just sit in my room while hundreds of people died. My ex-wife Lisa had always criticized my impulsiveness, my tendency to act on instinct rather than careful planning. Tonight, that impulsiveness might be the only thing standing between innocent families and a horrible death. The sound of laughter drifted up from the dining room as the first course was served. I could picture the scene. Families celebrating anniversaries and birthdays, couples on romantic getaways, retirees finally enjoying the golden years they'd worked their entire lives to afford, all of them trusting that the people they'd paid to keep them safe would actually do so. There's something else, Miguel said, his strength fading, but his determination growing stronger. The medical bay. They have equipment there, supplies for treating chemical exposure. If we can't stop the poisoning, maybe we can save some of the victims. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. The medical bay would be staffed by ship's doctors who might not be part of the conspiracy, or at least who would be bound by medical ethics to help poisoning victims regardless of their source. But getting there meant traveling through public areas where security would be watching for us. I helped Miguel to his feet, supporting his weight as we prepared to leave my stateroom. The hallway outside was decorated with cheerful artwork and filled with the sounds of vacation joy, but it felt like walking through a tomb knowing what was coming. Other passengers smiled and nodded as they passed, completely unaware that we were all potential victims in someone's deadly experiment. The elevator down to deck 3 felt like descending into hell. Each floor we passed brought us closer to the dining areas where the killing was about to begin, and closer to the medical bay where we hoped to find allies, or at least supplies to help the victims. But it also brought us deeper into the ship's interior, farther from escape routes, and closer to the people who wanted us dead. Miguel, if we get separated, you need to find a way off this ship. Take the evidence to the authorities. Make sure the world knows what happened here. I pressed the folder of documents into his hands, but he pushed them back toward me. You take them, Doctor. I can't swim, and I won't abandon the other crew members. Some of them have families, children who depend on their income. They don't deserve to die for working on the wrong ship. His courage in the face of certain death made my own fears seem selfish and small. The medical bay was located on deck 3, near the ship's center of gravity, to minimize motion during rough weather. As we approached the double doors marked with red crosses, I could hear voices inside discussing dinner preparations and passenger requests for seasickness medication. Normal medical concerns for a normal cruise evening. Dr. Amanda Kessler looked up from her charts when we entered, her professional smile faltering when she saw Miguel's blood-soaked uniform and my obvious distress. What happened here? Did someone have an accident? Doctor, we need to talk privately. It's about the food service tonight. I kept my voice calm and professional, drawing on years of experience dealing with medical emergencies. There's been contamination in the main dining room, possibly intentional. The change in Dr. Kessler's expression told me everything I needed to know. Fear, recognition, and something that looked like relief flooded her face. She'd been waiting for someone to discover the truth, hoping someone would come forward with evidence she could act on without destroying her career or endangering her life. How much do you know? She asked, moving quickly to lock the medical bay doors and activate privacy protocols that would prevent our conversation from being monitored through the ship's communication systems. Everything. The chemical weapons testing, the previous cruises, the systematic murder of passengers to refine biological agents. I spread Consuela's evidence across her examination table, watching her face grow paler as she recognized documents and photographs. Dr. Kessler sat heavily in her chair, the weight of months of suppressed knowledge finally finding an outlet. I've been documenting suspicious deaths for 8 months, sending reports to the CDC that disappear into bureaucratic black holes. The symptoms never matched the supposed food poisoning diagnoses, but I was ordered to sign death certificates without performing proper autopsies. Who gave you those orders? But I already suspected the answer. The conspiracy had to include someone with authority over the ship's medical operations, someone who could suppress evidence and control the narrative around passenger deaths. Captain Bernard Volkov. He's been running this operation since he took command of the Paradise Dream 2 years ago, but he's not acting alone. There are people on shore, pharmaceutical companies, and government contractors who provide the chemicals and analyze the results. Dr. Kessler pulled out her own hidden files, medical records that painted a picture of systematic experimentation on unwitting victims. The documents revealed the true scope of the horror we were dealing with. Caribbean Dreamlines wasn't just a cruise company. It was a front for biological weapons research conducted by a consortium of defense contractors and foreign governments. Passengers were classified by age, health status, and nationality, then exposed to different chemical agents to study their effects on various population groups. Dr. Kessler, dinner service started 20 minutes ago. How long before the chemicals take effect? The question felt like swallowing broken glass, but I needed to know how much time we had to organize a response. Based on previous tests, symptoms begin within 30 to 60 minutes of ingestion. Nausea, disorientation, seizures, then rapid organ failure. Most victims die within 4 hours, but some linger for days in agony. Her clinical description couldn't hide the horror and guilt in her voice. The first screams echoed through the ship's ventilation system at exactly 8:47 p.m., high-pitched wails of terror and pain that cut through the gentle hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of the ship's orchestra. Dr. Kessler's equipment immediately began receiving emergency calls from passengers experiencing sudden illness. "It's starting," she said unnecessarily, her hands already moving to prepare treatment supplies for the flood of victims we were about to receive. "I have antidotes for some of the chemicals they've used, but not enough for 200 people. We'll have to choose who lives and who dies." The moral weight of that decision crashed down on all of us, playing God with strangers' lives based on age, health, and likelihood of survival. But there was no alternative, unless we could find a way to stop the poisoning at its source or evacuate the ship before more people were affected. Miguel had grown pale and weak, but his resolve remained strong. "The kitchen storage area. If we can neutralize the remaining contaminated food, we might prevent more people from being poisoned. The chemicals are in refrigerated containers marked with false labels." "That's suicide," Dr. Kessler protested. "The kitchen will be crawling with security by now. They'll kill you on sight." But even as she spoke, she was preparing a medical kit with antidotes and emergency supplies. Her actions betrayed her true feelings about the plan. More screams echoed through the ship, closer now, as passengers in the nearest dining areas began experiencing symptoms. The sounds of panic were mixing with announcements from the ship's officers declaring a medical emergency and requesting calm from unaffected passengers. The cover-up was already beginning. "There's another option," Dr. Kessler said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around us. "The ship's emergency protocols include procedures for chemical contamination. If I can activate the right alarms, automatic systems will seal off affected areas and initiate decontamination procedures." "What kind of decontamination?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be as horrifying as everything else we'd discovered. "Complete sterilization, high-temperature incineration of all organic matter in contaminated areas. It's designed to prevent biological weapons from reaching shore in case of accidental release during testing." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence for everyone still trapped in the dining areas. The choice was impossible: allow hundreds of people to die slowly from chemical poisoning, or incinerate them quickly to prevent the spread of biological weapons. Either way, we were talking about mass murder on a scale that made individual heroism seem meaningless. That's when the lights went out. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows as the ship's power systems switched to backup generators. The sudden darkness was accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside the medical bay, and voices speaking in accented English that suggested foreign military or intelligence backgrounds. "Dr. Kessler, we know you have unauthorized personnel in your facility. Open the doors immediately, or we will breach them by force." Captain Volkov's voice carried absolute authority, backed by the threat of deadly violence. Miguel grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "There's a service passage behind the medical supply cabinet. It leads to the engine room where we might be able to reach the emergency communication systems." His knowledge of the ship's layout was proving invaluable, but I wondered how much longer he could continue before blood loss overcame his determination. We moved the cabinet as quietly as possible while Dr. Kessler gathered essential medical supplies and destroyed evidence that might incriminate other innocent crew members. The service passage was narrow and filled with pipes and electrical conduits that made movement difficult, but it offered concealment from the security teams that were systematically searching the ship. The screams from the dining areas were getting weaker, replaced by an ominous silence that suggested the poison was taking its final toll on the victims. The ship's announcement system kept broadcasting reassurances about isolated food poisoning incidents and comprehensive medical care for affected passengers, lies designed to prevent panic among the survivors. "Miguel, how many people work for Caribbean Dreamlines who aren't part of this conspiracy?" Dr. Kessler whispered as we crawled through the service tunnel toward the engine room. "Maybe a dozen out of 300 crew members. Most of us are from poor countries, working for money to send home to our families. We don't ask questions about things that seem wrong because we need the jobs." His voice carried shame and anger in equal measure. The engine room was a cathedral of machinery, filled with the thunderous noise of diesel engines and the hum of electrical systems that kept the ship operational. The engineering crew was focused on their instruments, monitoring the power distribution and propulsion systems that were keeping us moving toward whatever destination Captain Volkov had planned. Chief Engineer Klaus Brennan looked up from his control panel when we emerged from the service tunnel, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he recognized the blood on Miguel's uniform and the medical equipment Dr. Kessler was carrying. "What's happening up there? We've been getting emergency power requests from the medical bay and reports of some kind of outbreak in the dining areas." His German accent was thick, but his English was clear, and his concern appeared genuine. "Klaus, listen carefully," Dr. Kessler said, using the authority of her medical position to command attention. "The passengers in the main dining room have been deliberately poisoned with chemical weapons. The ship's officers are involved in biological weapons testing using cruise passengers as test subjects." The chief engineer's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, horror, and finally grim determination. I suspected something was wrong with this ship's operations. Too many unusual modifications to the ventilation systems, sealed storage areas that weren't on the original plans, communication equipment that bypassed normal maritime protocols. Can you help us contact the Coast Guard or Navy? We need immediate evacuation for the surviving passengers and medical treatment for the poisoning victims. I was already thinking through the logistics of rescue operations, though the challenges seemed insurmountable. Klaus moved to a control panel I hadn't noticed before, one that was separate from the ship's main communication systems. Emergency Maritime Distress Beacon bypasses all ship communication systems and broadcasts directly to international rescue coordination centers, but activating it will alert Captain Volkov that we're trying to expose his operation. How long before rescue arrives? Dr. Kessler asked, checking her medical supplies and calculating how long she could keep poisoning victims alive with the antidotes she had available. 6 to 8 hours in good weather, but we're in international waters, and there are legal complications about boarding a foreign-flagged vessel without permission from the flag state. Klaus's technical knowledge was comprehensive, but the legal and political obstacles were beyond his expertise. Miguel had been growing weaker throughout our conversation, but he suddenly grabbed my arm with desperate strength. There's something else. The other ships. Caribbean Dream Lines operates 12 cruise ships, all modified for the same purpose. If we expose this operation, they'll just move their testing to another vessel. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than we'd imagined. An entire fleet of floating laboratories conducting biological weapons research on paying customers, protected by international maritime law, and the assumption that cruise ship deaths were natural occurrences in an elderly population. Klaus activated the emergency beacon, while Dr. Kessler tried to establish communication with medical authorities who might be able to provide guidance on treating chemical weapons poisoning. But our efforts were interrupted by the sound of explosive charges breaching the engine room's main access doors. Armed figures in tactical gear poured into the engine room, their weapons trained on the engineering crew, and their movements coordinated with military precision. But these weren't ship security officers or even regular mercenaries. Their equipment and tactics suggested special operations training, possibly foreign military units operating under commercial cover. Captain Volkov followed the assault team, his naval uniform replaced by business attire that made him look more like a corporate executive than a ship's officer. Dr. Kessler, you have caused significant disruption to important scientific research. Your interference will cost lives and delay crucial advances in defensive biological warfare capabilities. Defensive? Dr. Kessler's voice carried outrage and disbelief. You're murdering innocent people to test weapons of mass destruction? There's nothing defensive about systematic genocide disguised as vacation cruises. The research conducted on these vessels has prevented numerous terrorist attacks and saved thousands of American lives, Volkov replied, with the calm conviction of someone who'd rationalized mass murder as patriotic duty. The temporary sacrifice of a few hundred civilians enables us to develop countermeasures against biological weapons that hostile nations are already deploying. The rationalization was sophisticated propaganda, but it couldn't disguise the fundamental evil of using unwitting civilians as laboratory animals. Miguel struggled to his feet, despite his injuries, his voice weak, but filled with righteous anger. My sister died trying to stop you. Consuelo was 22 years old, working to support our mother and 3 younger siblings. She wasn't a soldier who volunteered for dangerous duty. She was a cook who wanted to send money home to Guatemala. Volkov's expression didn't change, but one of his tactical team members raised his weapon toward Miguel with obvious intent to silence him permanently. That's when Klaus made his move, triggering an emergency shutdown of the ship's main engines that plunged the entire vessel into mechanical chaos. The sudden loss of power and propulsion sent everyone stumbling as the ship's motion changed dramatically. Emergency systems activated throughout the vessel, sealing bulkheads and activating fire suppression systems that filled the air with chemical suppressants designed to prevent explosions. In the confusion, Dr. Kessler grabbed her medical kit and headed for the service passage, while Miguel and I followed Klaus toward what he called the Emergency Command Center, a backup control room that could operate independently of the ship's main systems. The emergency beacon is still transmitting, Klaus shouted over the noise of alarms and failing machinery. But we need to keep the ship operational long enough for rescue forces to reach us. If we lose power completely, we'll drift into shipping lanes and create an international incident. The emergency command center was a cramped space filled with backup controls for essential ship functions. From here, Klaus could maintain basic power, communications, and navigation while keeping us moving toward the nearest port instead of deeper into international waters where rescue would be more difficult. How many passengers are still alive? Dr. Kessler asked while reviewing the medical reports that were still coming through the ship's internal communication systems. The numbers were horrifying. Over 180 confirmed deaths from chemical poisoning, with dozens more in critical condition. The survivors are mostly children and people who didn't eat dinner in the main dining room, Klaus reported, monitoring passenger compartments through the ship's security cameras. But they're trapped in their staterooms by security teams who are preventing them from reaching the medical bay or lifeboat stations. Miguel had collapsed in one of the command center chairs, his face pale and his breathing shallow from blood loss. But his voice remained steady as he provided crucial information about the ship's layout and security procedures. There are service passages throughout the ship that security doesn't monitor. We can use them to reach the survivors and coordinate evacuation. Evacuation to where? I asked. We're still hours from the nearest port, and the lifeboats aren't designed for long-distance survival in open ocean. The practical challenges of rescuing hundreds of people from a compromised cruise ship were overwhelming, especially with hostile forces controlling most of the vessel. Dr. Kessler was already preparing medical kits and antidotes for distribution to survivors who might have been exposed to lower levels of the chemical weapons. We don't need to get everyone off the ship immediately. We just need to keep them alive until legitimate rescue forces arrive and can provide proper medical treatment. The ship's communication systems crackled with transmissions from what sounded like military aircraft approaching our position. Klaus adjusted his emergency equipment to receive the signals more clearly, revealing voices speaking in English with American accents, coordinating what appeared to be a large-scale rescue operation. This is USS Hampton requesting immediate response from Paradise Dream. We have reports of chemical weapons release and mass casualty event aboard your vessel. Prepare for emergency boarding by medical and security personnel. The voice carried military authority backed by the power of the United States Navy. But Captain Volkov's response over the ship's main communication system was equally authoritative. USS Hampton, this is Paradise Dream reporting medical emergency contained. We are proceeding to port under our own power with medical assistance from our own personnel. No boarding assistance required at this time. He's lying to the Navy, Dr. Kessler said unnecessarily, claiming everything is under control to prevent military intervention while his people eliminate evidence and witnesses. The scope of the cover-up was becoming clear. Present the incident as a minor food poisoning outbreak that was handled professionally by the ship's crew. Klaus was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, listening to communications between various military and civilian agencies that were responding to the emergency beacon. There are at least 6 vessels converging on our position, including Coast Guard cutters and Navy destroyers, but they're being told by someone in authority that the situation is contained and boarding is not necessary. Someone with enough influence to override military emergency response protocols, I realized. This conspiracy reaches into the Pentagon or intelligence agencies with authority over military operations. The implications made our situation seem even more hopeless. Miguel's strength was fading, but his determination remained unbroken. We have to get the evidence to the rescue ships. The photographs, the documents, the medical records. Without proof, they'll cover up everything and start over with a different ship. The evidence was still in my hands, but getting it to the approaching rescue vessels would require reaching the ship's exterior decks while avoiding the security teams that were systematically hunting for survivors who might expose their operation. The task seemed impossible, but it was our only chance for justice. There's a way, Klaus said, studying his ship schematics. The mail processing center has direct access to external cargo handling equipment. We can use the ship's postal system to transfer evidence to rescue vessels without direct contact that could be prevented or monitored. It was an absurd plan that might actually work. Cruise ships processed thousands of postcards and packages daily, with automated systems for transferring mail to shore facilities. If we could access those systems, we might be able to get evidence to the rescue ships without alerting security to our location. The mail processing center was located on Deck 2, near the ship's center to minimize motion effects on delicate equipment. Getting there required traversing sections of the ship that were now controlled by hostile forces, but the service passages Miguel had shown us might provide concealment for most of the journey. Dr. Kessler was reluctant to leave her medical equipment, but she understood that exposing the truth was more important than treating individual victims if it prevented the same atrocities from happening on other ships. I'm coming with you. My medical testimony will carry more weight with investigators than passenger statements. We left Klaus in the emergency command center, maintaining basic ship functions and monitoring rescue communications while we attempted to reach the mail processing facility. The service passages were even more cramped with 3 people, but they provided protection from the security teams that were searching passenger areas. The sound of helicopters overhead indicated that rescue forces were positioning themselves around the ship, probably preparing for emergency medical evacuation of poisoning victims. But the continued radio communications suggested that Captain Volkov was still successfully convincing authorities that the situation was under control. The mail processing center was automated and unmanned, filled with sorting equipment and packaging materials for handling passenger correspondence. But the cargo transfer system Klaus had mentioned was more sophisticated than I'd expected. Pneumatic tubes and mechanical conveyors that could move packages directly to external loading points. How do we know the rescue ships will understand what we're sending them? Dr. Kessler asked, while helping me package the evidence in waterproof containers designed for ship-to-shore mail transfer. We include a cover letter explaining the situation and requesting immediate boarding by military medical personnel, I replied, writing quickly on Paradise Dream stationery that would authenticate the source of our communication. Miguel was barely conscious, but he managed to provide additional evidence he'd been carrying. Audio recordings his sister had made of Captain Volkov discussing biological weapons testing with foreign contacts, and photographs of equipment installations that weren't part of normal cruise ship operations. The mail transfer system activated with mechanical precision, sending our evidence packages through pressurized tubes toward external cargo handling equipment that would deliver them to approaching rescue vessels. But the process triggered alarms throughout the ship that immediately alerted security to our location. They know where we are, Dr. Kessler said, grabbing her medical kit and helping support Miguel as we prepared to evacuate the mail processing center. We need to get back to Klaus before they trap us in this section of the ship. The sound of cutting torches indicated that security teams were breaching the sealed bulkheads that had been protecting us from direct assault, but they were also cutting through structural elements that were essential for the ship's integrity, potentially compromising the vessel's ability to remain seaworthy. We were halfway back to the emergency command center when the ship's hull was breached by what sounded like military cutting charges. The USS Hampton's boarding party was finally taking action based on the evidence we'd transmitted, but their timing couldn't have been worse for our immediate survival. Armed conflict erupted throughout the ship as Navy SEALs encountered Captain Volkov's security teams in close-quarters combat. The cruise ship became a battlefield with civilian survivors trapped between legitimate military forces and foreign operatives who were fighting to prevent exposure of their biological weapons program. Klaus's voice crackled through the ship's emergency communication system. All personnel, military boarding in progress. Hostile forces are attempting to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. Survivors should shelter in place until legitimate military personnel can provide evacuation. But sheltering in place wasn't an option for us. Miguel needed immediate medical attention that only the Navy medical team could provide, and our testimony was crucial for understanding the scope of the biological weapons conspiracy. We had to reach the boarding party before Volkov's people eliminated us as witnesses. The emergency command center was under siege when we arrived, with Klaus defending the entrance against 3 tactical team members who were trying to prevent him from communicating with the rescue forces. Dr. Kessler's medical kit included emergency medications that she used to keep Miguel conscious, while I helped Klaus coordinate with the Navy boarding party. This is Petty Officer Williams, U.S. Navy. Identify yourselves and your location for immediate extraction. The voice on Klaus's radio carried professional authority and offered the first hope we'd felt since this nightmare began. This is Chief Engineer Brennan with civilian survivors, including medical personnel and witnesses to biological weapons testing. We're in the emergency command center on Deck 4, but hostile forces are attempting to reach our position. The sound of explosions and automatic weapons fire was getting closer as Navy SEALs fought their way through the ship toward our location. But Captain Volkov's security teams were well-equipped and highly trained, making the corridor-to-corridor fighting extraordinarily dangerous for everyone involved. Petty Officer Williams, be advised that the ship's medical officer, Dr. Kessler, is with us and has detailed knowledge of chemical weapons used against passengers. Priority medical evacuation required for poisoning victims and critical witness testimony. Miguel stirred in his chair, his voice weak but filled with urgency. Tell them about the other ships. 12 vessels in the Caribbean Dreamlines fleet, all modified for biological weapons testing. This has to stop tonight or hundreds more people will die. The radio crackled with confirmation that our evidence packages had been received and were being transmitted to federal agencies with jurisdiction over biological weapons crimes. The FBI, CDC, and military intelligence were coordinating a fleet-wide investigation that would expose the entire network simultaneously. That's when Captain Volkov appeared in the emergency command center doorway, his sidearm trained on Miguel while his remaining security team covered the other entrances. Gentlemen, your interference has caused considerable damage to important national security research, but it's not too late to minimize the consequences for everyone involved. This isn't national security research, Dr. Kessler replied with cold fury. This is mass murder disguised as scientific progress. You've killed hundreds of innocent people to test weapons of mass destruction for profit. The research conducted on these vessels has prevented biological attacks that would have killed thousands of American civilians. Volkov maintained his rationalization, even as explosions echoed through the ship from the ongoing military assault. Your emotional attachment to individual casualties blinds you to the strategic necessity of defensive weapons development. Klaus kept his hands on the radio controls while addressing Volkov directly. Captain, U.S. Navy personnel are aboard this vessel conducting a lawful investigation of war crimes. Surrender now and cooperate with military authorities, and perhaps some accommodation can be reached regarding your prosecution. Volkov's laugh was bitter and filled with contempt. There will be no prosecution, Chief Engineer. The agencies that contracted for this research have authority that supersedes military investigations. This incident will be classified and buried, and everyone involved will disappear into the intelligence community's black budget programs. But his confidence was undermined by the sound of Navy SEALs breaching the final barriers between their position and the emergency command center. Military voices were coordinating assault procedures, and the distinctive sound of flashbang grenades indicated they were preparing for room-by-room clearing operations. This is your final warning, Captain, Klaus said into his radio. U.S. military personnel are requesting immediate surrender of all hostile forces and full cooperation with federal investigation of biological weapons crimes aboard this vessel. The emergency command center's door exploded inward as Navy SEALs detonated breaching charges, filling the room with smoke and debris while tactical teams poured through the opening with weapons ready. But Volkov had anticipated their assault, triggering what appeared to be a ship-wide self-destruct sequence designed to eliminate all evidence of the biological weapons program. All hands abandon ship, Klaus announced over the ship's emergency system, while his controls showed critical failures throughout the vessel's structural and safety systems. Hull breach imminent. This is not a drill. The Paradise Dream was dying around us, but the Navy SEALs were professionals who'd trained for exactly this scenario. Medical personnel immediately began treating Miguel and other survivors, while engineering specialists worked with Klaus to keep essential systems operational long enough for evacuation. "Sir, we need to get you to the helicopter immediately," Petty Officer Williams said, helping Dr. Kessler gather her medical evidence while other team members carried Miguel toward the evacuation point. "Federal prosecutors are standing by to take your testimony about the biological weapons program." As we were lifted off the sinking cruise ship by Navy helicopters, I could see other vessels from the Caribbean Dreamline's fleet being boarded by military forces in coordinated operations across the Caribbean. The evidence we'd risked our lives to preserve was exposing a network of biological weapons research that reached into the highest levels of government and international defense contracting. 6 months later, I testified before a congressional committee about the systematic murder of cruise ship passengers for biological weapons research, helping to expose a conspiracy that resulted in the prosecution of dozens of military contractors, government officials, and foreign intelligence operatives who had turned vacation cruises into floating laboratories for testing weapons of mass destruction on unwitting civilians.